Shalom everyone, you're here again with another episode of Vayikra. I'm very thankful that you've joined me again. I apologize that last week's recording only really came out this week, and that was because we were on the Aviv search. Anyone following that knows how much controversy there is over the subject. I actually might talk a little bit about something that is connected to the Aviv search, but not necessarily focusing on the Aviv search. We are this week beginning a new book, the Sefer Vayiqra. And I'm just looking at my own Bible and remembering how many notes I actually have on Vayiqra. And Vayiqra, as many of you know, those who follow the series know that the temple subjects are very dear to my heart from a very, very young age. And I know of many other people that's very dear to their heart as well. And I love sharing with those people, and I love hearing what they have to say. And I have several friends who are coming out with series about the temple service, and things of that nature. I actually want to stick really just to the text itself. I have my friends who are mixing in things like Mishnah and Talmud. I just want to focus on the text itself and try to decipher what the text is saying. I'm actually looking at a lot of literary notes which explain how the text is built. There are many things. There are so many things I can say. I mean, I can probably sit here for 5 hours just talking about just one parasha. There are so many things, but I'm going to have to squeeze this all into about an hour. That's usually how long the program is. And first of all, the name Vayiqra. There are a few things here. First of all, there's the famous small aleph. Why do we have these big and small letters in the biblical text? And in truth, I once asked a friend about this. I wanted to hear what my friend had to say, and he said to me that he thinks that these were basically scribal mistakes. But because of the mindset of sanctifying everything that's around us, he understood that the scribes saw some earlier scribes, someone they held as being very important, putting in this tiny little aleph, and they decided to sanctify that and therefore preserved a scribal error. In truth, really, when you dig into rabbinic sources that deal with these scribal phenomena, the answer is that we actually don't necessarily know. But I think the possibility of a scribal error is very, very, very high here. And, scrolls are handwritten, and it takes time to write them. And as far as I know, based on the material I've read about different practices of writing, sometimes they try to really hasten the writing, and they would end up making mistakes along the way. So it's actually quite possible that an aleph was just omitted, because you can write the word Vayiqra without an aleph, and it still means Vayiqra. And someone realized, we have a mistake here, and they added a tiny little aleph somehow, either hanging on top, which is attested in Dead Sea Scrolls, or in between. If there was a little bit of space, they could squeeze in a tiny little aleph, and then that's how the aleph came to be. It's historical probability. But the word Vayiqra itself, I've seen scholars write the Hebrew text, biblical Hebrew text, begin arbitrarily with a vav in the beginning. But this is obviously not true. The fact remains that Vayiqra is a direct continuation of the end of the book of Exodus, and this is why we actually have a consecutive description here. And what we have in front of us is a description of the tabernacle in Exodus 40, verse 34 to 38, which is the end, and it describes that the cloud ascended over Ohel Moed, and that's the glory of God, Kevod Adonai, and Moshe was unable to be in the tent at that time, which we hear this description several times in the future as well, especially with the temple of King Solomon, which I'm hoping to get to at one point. And we have this description of Moshe is unable, and then we have like this little quick break off in verses 36, 37, 38, which gives us a general description of the reality of the tabernacle. And what happens in Vayiqra 1 is it basically continues our description from verse 35. And this is not unusual. This happens quite a bit. So really, if you look at some of the separation of the Bible into different documents, which is not necessarily document hypothesis, it just classifies style of language to different groupings. And as several people have said in the past, like Kasuto, you can have different styles in one text. It doesn't mean you have different writers. I mean, that would be as if the human mind is limited to write only one style. You don't, as some have said, you don't write a history book as if it's a description for how to make cake. You use different styles. But human beings, because we're exposed to different types of writing, one person can write the same style, can write one book with different styles in it depending on what the intent is. And that's the thing with the book of Leviticus. The book of Leviticus falls in the category of the dry, descriptive, sometimes repetitive language that gives us instructions of how to do sacrifices and how to practice different things. Now, if you look at an overall description of the book of Leviticus, basically chapters 1 to 5 are about the sacrifices, where the sacrifice comes from, how to work with it. Then chapters 6 to 7 are administrative rules for the priests about how to prepare a sacrifice and how to consume it. Chapters 8 to 10 is a description of the preparation of the Kohanim of that time frame, basically Aaron and his sons, how they prepare themselves and how they reach a point that they can actually work in the temple. Chapter 11 deals with clean and unclean food and uncleanness that comes from coming in contact with animals. Chapter 12, birth. Chapter 13, leprosy. 14 is purification from leprosy. Chapter 15, Zav and Zavan Nida, basically types of flowing from the body that happens. Chapter 16 is Yom Kippurim, which we're going to have a lot of fun with that one, in my opinion. Chapter 17 deals with slaughtering animals and what you do. How do you manipulate their blood? Especially the idea of consumption of meat and the slaughter of animals, it's a very interesting subject, especially if you look at what some Karaites have had to say about this subject. There were Karaites who were vegetarians deliberately because they believed you cannot consume meat without actually having a temple. And it wouldn't necessarily come from mourning. I mean, some of the principles they worked by were based on the idea of mourning the temple. But here it's also connected to the idea that there's no such thing as mundane meat. All meat was sacrificial. Chapter 19 is what we can call the book of holiness. It deals with the idea of how do we become holy. And what's very interesting about this is the Torah gives us a description of what is holiness. And I always ask the question, I've always raised this question in front of different friends of mine, especially ones that have unique practices that they go by, that they're trying to make themselves holier. And I said, listen, the Torah says, "Kadoshim tihu ki kadosh ani Adonai Elohechem." You'll be holy, for I am holy, I am the Lord your God. And then it kind of goes into this description of what do you do, and these are the rules of holiness. This is how you become a holy person. This is how we become a holy nation. And I wondered, why are you adding to this biblical description? Chapter 20 deals with inappropriate taboos or sexual taboos. We have that also, by the way, in chapter 18. We also have sexual taboos there. Chapters 21 to 22, special laws when it comes to the priests, cleanliness, shaving, not mutilating one's body. Some of these rules, by the way, repeat themselves when it comes to Israel, except for there's some variants. Like, for example, an Israelite to some degree is allowed to shave, while a Kohen is never allowed to shave. And I have 2 articles about that on my website. You can read those. Chapter 23 deals with the feasts, which is a hot topic today. It's something that everyone's talking about. Actually, people talk about it all the time. But at the moment, it's even more important because of the Aviv search. Then we have chapter 24 that deals with some extra points about the feast, but also a lot of stories that happened, like, for example, the blasphemer. Chapter 25 deals with this calendar again. We have the calendar of the holy years, the Shemitah year and the Yovel year. And some people claim the Yovel year begins today. And, the argument when exactly is the Yovel, I think, is a legitimate argument, because the thing that we know is that we base the calculation of the Shemitah on what Maimonides has to say. And it seems to be that it's possible Maimonides actually made a mistake. My approach to this is basically, listen, we have no pure way of knowing exactly when. Some people try to create these elaborate calculations very similar to the Book of Jubilees. And I say, listen, the Book of Jubilees is a very sectarian book. I can't trust a book like that. I'm saying this from a historical perspective. I can't trust a book like that. And therefore, I have to be very, very careful with it. So what I strongly recommend when it comes to the Shemitah years is, listen, just let's decide on a year and just do it that way. It's not exactly like a Shabbat. Shabbat is something which is designed into the calculation of a week. Shabbat is always going to be a very specific day. The Shemitah year was dependent on when Israel actually entered the land. And one of the points that I think is actually correct about this is that you can actually reset it, and you can when we re-enter the land, then it's reset, and then you start counting 7 years again. I don't agree with this idea that the Book of Jubilees presents as if it's there since the beginning of the earth, and somehow it fell in that they entered the land exactly. I mean, these are things that you can't really prove, and there's no point in driving people crazy. Okay, sectarianism is the idea of wanting to be special and unique. Let's openly admit that. Then chapter 26 deals with the blessings and the curses, and there actually are slight differences. I mean, there's one major difference between the blessings and the curses in Leviticus, where it does end with, and at the end of it, I'll bring you back and bless you, while Deuteronomy actually doesn't do that. And then chapter 27 deals with a few more elements of holiness, like, for example, taking vows and oaths and things like that, which unfortunately people say, I swear to God. That's almost borderline taking a vow. And you have to be very careful when you say that. So, Vayiqra means, and he called. Moshe was called into the temple. This is to allow him to enter. This was to open up an opening for Moshe to get through the cloud so he can actually stand in the temple, or in the tabernacle. And from that point on, this is where God speaks with Moshe. Unless something unique happens, this is the place. Now we've narrowed it down to one place, the tabernacle. Now, it's very important to point this out. The tabernacle in the desert does have the ideal of one place of worship. But that's because they were in the desert. This is because they were all camped around one place. This actually does not contradict my theory when it comes to Deuteronomy, where the Deuteronomy does not really say one place of worship. You can argue that. It's possible if you want to link Vayiqra to Dvarim and say they share an ideal. However, I find it very interesting that Dvarim says, "Makom asher yivchar Adonai," the place which the Lord will choose. If the tabernacle is the place that God chooses, then wherever the tabernacle lands, that's where it's chosen, and therefore there's no need to say a place which God will choose. Wherever you plunk the tabernacle, that's where it is. It doesn't really matter. And we don't have a description that God chose Shiloh. They put it at Shiloh, probably because Shiloh wasn't a main road and it was in the middle of everything. So I have difficulty with the idea that Dvarim says that there's one place, but Leviticus obviously has the idea of one place, but that's because of the historical occurrence here, that they are sitting in the desert in one camp. And that's why the Vayiqra repeats it over and over again, don't do worship anywhere else. While Deuteronomy, responding to the new reality of entering to the land, said, listen, you can't tell everyone there's only one temple and somehow figure out how everyone's supposed to show up there, and everyone that needs to bring a sacrifice has to travel for miles and miles, for days over days, to arrive at this one temple. None of it makes any historical sense. And this is why I reject the idea that Deuteronomy says there's only one place of worship. And I agree that the idea of one place of worship does appear from the times of King Yoshiyahu or Josiah, but I don't think that is the ideal of Deuteronomy. And I completely reject the theory many scholars present, if not all of them, that Deuteronomy is a creation of the first temple from the times of King Josiah, based on this idea. I don't think it's correct, and therefore the entire hypothesis is completely ridiculous. So in any case, we have a very dry description, and we have a lot of sequences of actions. And if I cover the actions which are described about the majority of the sacrifices here, we basically have an action called smicha. Okay, I'm not going to the animals themselves yet. I'm first talking about the actions that happen. So it says, "V'samach yado al rosh ha'olah." He will place his one hand. This is important. There's only one hand being placed on the head of the animal. not two. A lot of descriptions show two hands, and even have, rabbinic descriptions that go into this whole thing of placing two hands and everything. No, two hands was done under very specific circumstances. A regular sacrifice done for an individual was done with one hand. So you place one hand, left or right, it doesn't really tell us. There are some people who would say yad is different than yamin. Yamin means right. Yad, they'll say, oh, that's basically another word for left. I don't know. Maybe the idea is to put your dominant hand down. This is why the text never specifically says yamin or smol. One may argue the opposite. If we would use the word yamin really indicates dominant hand, and most people are right-handed, or most people are right-handed. Whatever the case may be, it's a placing of one hand. The question is raised, what is this placing of one hand? Or what is the placing of a hand in general? And there are a lot of different opinions about this. There are different ideas, and some of the interpretations as follows. There's the idea of a transmission, that the person who places his hand on the sacrifice is transmitting something to the animal, maybe their sin. Then another interpretation indicates the idea of replacing places, that when you place your hand, it's as if now this is you. Another interpretation says that the placing of the hand indicates ownership, that the person placing their hand on the sacrifice is saying, yeah, this is my sacrifice. And so these are three different opinions that exist about this. And we find, for example, the idea of placing hands is authoritating as well. For example, when Moshe sanctifies the Levites, there's placing of hands as well. And a lot of people do this today. For example, I've seen it in circles which are not necessarily Orthodox or Jewish circles, that people place their hands on others to indicate, we identify with you, or we authoritate you, and so on. So it's possible that this action is just to authoritate, to say, yeah, this is here in my stead. Maybe even all three opinions are correct. Then there's Veshahat. Now, Shahad, it says, for example, it says in our verses here, Veshahatet ben habakar lifnei Adonai. He will slaughter the son of the cattle, the son of the ox before the Lord. So as if Adonai obviously means the tabernacle, usually means Leviticus, and throughout the majority of the Torah, Lifnei Adonai usually means before God in the tabernacle. That's where the presence now is. Now, Shahat it's very interesting, because Shahat, first of all, is an action that represents the idea of slaughtering by the neck. In Old Southern Arabic, Shahat is basically the same thing. So a lot of people make this argument, how can you know what the Torah means without oral Torah? Look, how do you know how to do shchita, how to do the ritual slaughtering? So first of all, it depends how you define oral Torah. If you want to hear about oral Torah, I have a very long series I've been doing on talking Torah, about oral Torah. And the answer is yes, this is a kind of oral Torah. The oral Torah in this case is meaning of words. Basically, every language has this. We have a understood collective meaning of words, which means if I say shahat, everyone immediately knows it means to slaughter by the neck. I mean, today, even if you walk up to any Jew or any Hebrew speaker and you say shchita, they'll immediately know shchita means to slaughter by the neck, unless you're using it as hyperbole to indicate something, a slaughterhouse or something like that, something very violent. But most people, almost everyone will tell you, shchita means by the neck. So it's not really necessary. You don't need oral Torah for that, but it's a type of oral Torah. This is one of the points I make. The meaning of words, the understanding throughout the ages of what words mean, is what we can define as oral Torah. Now, what's interesting is this word gets replaced by the word zavah. Zevah really is the zviha, also in Arabic dabiha, or in Aramaic dabah. Which, by the way, at one point became the word tabah. It kind of rolled into Hebrew through northern dialects, and we can find it in certain books in the Bible, especially Samuel, which part of it actually is very northern, because it's in the setting of Samuel, and Samuel was really an Ephraimite. The biha, or zevah, for biblical Hebrew really means ritual slaughter, while shahat really means any slaughtering. So there's this whole debate. Does the Torah really know of, or does Leviticus even know of a principle of mundane slaughtering versus ritual or sanctified slaughter. And maybe this is the reason why, though in biblical Hebrew the word for ritual or sanctified slaughter is the word zavach, maybe the reason Leviticus uses the word shahat is because the leading principle in the entire book, though they technically should not interchange, the leading principle in the book is to actually always think of any action here being sanctified. So even if I use a word that technically refers to a mundane action, here it will always mean something in the holy sphere. And then there's Vayiqrivu bnei Aaron et Adam, so there's collecting of blood, and this is the point where a Kohen's position becomes important. Blood manipulation, which directly connects to the altar, that's the point when the Kohen actually has to stop doing his own work. We actually have a description in Chronicles where it says that Levites were slaughtered and they helped the Kohanim, but the Kohanim, we're talking about the Passover mentioned in 2 Chronicles, the Kohanim, the moment the blood had to start moving towards the altar, that's when a Kohen got involved. And really, even in rabbinic sources, it says that that's the point where the sacrificial system actually begins, which means everything that's not directly connected to the altar, that there's no need to draw near to the altar. And it's very interesting that the word korban and karav, korban being sacrifice and karav, which means to draw near, are very close to one another. They actually share the same root. If they share the same meaning, it's already a different discussion. But the principle of drawing near to the altar, which was considered to be a place where there is the presence of God, hence the fire from heaven coming down onto the altar to indicate presence of God, that from that point on, only a Kohen is allowed to work. People can walk near the altar. I mean, we have a description of Hannah, that she was standing in the court of the tabernacle, and she wasn't too far away from the entrance because Eli, who was an elderly man and was going blind, could still see her and see what she's doing. Okay? And what happens there is that it's very clear that Hannah was very close. So the ideas of like, don't come any closer to the altar. I mean, we have descriptions of people grabbing the horns of the altar. You know, it says, for example, even a murderer, from my altar, even from my altar will take him to die. On the idea that there is such a thing that even a regular person, can grab hold of the altar if necessary. So it wasn't that you weren't allowed to come near to the altar, you weren't allowed to do any service on the altar. The moment the Kohen walks with the blood, that's a transition from one point to the other. That now he isn't working in service. And they throw the blood, and in Second Temple we have descriptions of upper blood and lower blood depending on the type of sacrifice he had, and there was a red line known as Chota Sikra. Sikra really is red paint, and it was a marking on the altar. It's quite possible that that these things also existed. For example, you had blood that you pour on the yesod, on the foundation, on the bottom of the altar, and then you have places where you pour it on the horns themselves, and we explain the horns are not horns, it's just the corners, but the shape was a little bit like an ox horn, and that it's possible that the kalkov, that there is a little thing that's mentioned. The kalkov is like a little cleft, like a little shelf that sticks out. That actually might be the divider between the upper blood and the lower blood in the tabernacle and in the earlier altars that existed. So then it says, so we're talking about the first sacrifice, so they're throwing the blood around the altar. Now, throwing means like pouring or sprinkling to some degree. It wasn't like, I'm just going to throw this here. It's going to spray everywhere and make a mess. It's probably quite possible what it meant is that they walked around and they kind of sprinkled the blood around the altar. Now, in rabbinic sources, it talks about putting on two parallel horns, which means you go in the corner and you pour it on the corner and you're really covering two sides of the horn, which means that you've covered two sides, which means if you put in two parallel, or basically really not parallel, but really parallel like a part of an X, you can actually cover the entire altar. But I think what it means here is actually pouring it on each corner, on each side of the altar, and not trying to do this trick where you just go in a corner and you sprinkle there and then you've covered two ends. Though I think it's a possible trick, I just don't think that's what they necessarily did. And then what's interesting here is that v'samach v'shahat are in the singular. V'ikrivu v'zarku, and they draw near and they will throw, is in the plural. And then we have vifshit venitach, is again in the singular. So vifshit means to strip this, it's basically to skin the animal. Venitach otah lintachea is to cut it into portions. And then v'natnu b'nei Aaron esh al hamizbech, and then the sons of Aaron will place fire on the altar. Now, the reason I point this out is because v'samach is obviously the owner. V'shahat is still in the singular. What's interesting here is that the actions which are to the priests are written in the plural. The actions done by the owner are in the singular. So what's possible here is that, again, the actions where you don't need to draw near to the altar are done by the owner himself, which makes the work of the priest much easier. The priests have to deal with very specific actions, which means the owner is much more involved in the work of the sacrifice than actually any of us really realize. And what's important about this is, first of all, it means that a mundane person draws near to the altar when necessary. We don't have these restrictions of the second temple described in the Mishnah. And again, I always warn about this. Be very careful when you use a Mishnah to describe anything. But you have the owner involved, which means he has to be not too far away from the altar to do all of this, and he skins the animal, he cuts into portions, and then the priest put fire on the altar. Now, the question that's raised here is, why do they have to put fire on the altar every time? Does it mean they have to put fire on the altar every single time? Or is this again part of the everyday work they have to do? One of the things they have to do is put fire on the altar to make sure they can burn the sacrifice. We have to remember as well that every time you bring a sacrifice, you're going to put in almost the entire animal, especially if it's an olah, which is the sacrifice that goes completely up, which is the sacrifice we're dealing with at the moment. It's going to have its own fire. So there's a lot of these questions of how did the tabernacle actually function? If all of Israel have to show up there and say 20, 30, 50 people show up a day and they have their own sacrifices, there's no way of doing this on an entire day. This is why on a pragmatic level, you have to realize that there must have been more altars around the country to enable the possible quantities. And then it says, V'alchu etzim alayis, so we'll place wood on the fire, basically continue stoking the fire. V'alchu b'nei Aaron kohanim et hanetachim, and they will set the pieces on the fire with its entrails and the entrails. It says v'kirbo ucha v'yilchatz b'mayim, and its legs and its entrails he will wash in water, which again goes back to the owner. The owner is still heavily involved with doing the sacrifices. So we see that there's basically a sequence here of actions which are done to all the sacrifices. So we've covered that, and we've explained some of the elements here, which come with the sacrifice, and then the higher involvement of the owner. And this is a very important thing to me, because it's the temple of all of Israel. It's not the temple of the priests. It's not that the priests are completely separate from everyone else. This is a national temple. This is a temple for everyone. This is a temple for all of Israel. This is not a temple where you're only allowed to reach a certain point and then you say, no, you can't enter, you're not involved in anything except for standing there and looking. And it's very clear this is not what the Torah is actually saying. And I think that the descriptions that we have about the second temple, and again, the emphasis is on the second temple. A lot of people draw their information from the description of the second temple and not more than that. And the thing is that the second temple was influenced by certain elements of aristocracy. And there's a famous story about a Kohen. And some people say, the Talmud says it's Yochanan. Historians, basically what's known as Yochanan Holkinos or John Harkinius, or Holkinos really is the way it's supposed to be pronounced. And some people say it's Yanai, which is really another version of Yonatan. And it probably was Yanai. And he was considered to be a Sadducee priest. And he was a Hasmonean, and he also took the high priesthood. The high priesthood was given to him through many decisions that were made by, for example, Demeter II, the promises to Shimon, and Shimon was his great uncle, if I remember correctly. And basically they were Kohanim not by pure right. And a lot of people were very upset with him. And Yanai specifically was not a nice person. In many of the descriptions that we have, he was not a nice person. He might have been a hero for a lot of people because of the conquest that he did and the protection that he did for Israel or Judea at the time. But when it came to his relationship, when it comes to Torah, and when it comes to the elders of the community and the majority of the community, he was not a nice person. He was not your friendly neighborhood Cohen. He actually was a very nasty person that basically committed genocide against his own people. And what we find in the story is that he was citroned. The story goes that during Chag HaSukkot, the Pharisees had a practice to pour water on the altar, which, by the way, is not mentioned anywhere in the Torah, but that's not the point. That's the reason why when he was supposed to do this work as being the high priest, he poured the water on his feet instead on the side of the altar. And people threw their citrons, because this was the middle of Sukkot, people threw their citrons at him. And it even describes that one of the sides of the altar, one of the horns, was broken. And Josephus describes that he erected a wall between him and the altar and the rest of the people. And that's probably where we start seeing this segregation against non-Kohanim in the temple, the creation of what's known as the Israelite court, but probably prior to that there was no such thing. And also probably the distancing of women. For example, there was a thing in the Second Temple known as the Women's Gate, which was on the northern side, that women that had their sacrifices brought into the temple were not allowed to draw near to the altar, which is the opposite of what we find with Hannah in the book of Samuel, the beginning of the book of Samuel, or Shmuel. And they would stand there and they would peer in through the gate and see their sacrifice being offered. And the Talmud goes to this whole idea of that if they want to slaughter their sacrifice, women were not allowed to, but if, for example, an owner wanted to slaughter their sacrifice, they had to hold a 60-cubit knife, and all these, obviously theoretical. And the Talmud is very clear that this is theoretical. But the thing that we find here is this segregation. It shows up in the Second Temple. And there are other people in the Talmud that actually hint that this segregation is relatively new, because in the description of circling the altar during the Hosha'anot of Sukkot, one rabbi says that the Israelites did go in between, or Israel would go in between the altar and the ulam, or the temple itself, because everyone has to circle the altar, meaning that they had a memory that as long as you're not doing actual service, you were allowed to go into that area. But another rabbi says, no, they went like back and forth and made an illusion as if they're going in circles, because no one's allowed, if you're not a Kohen, you're not allowed to go in there. But what it gives us is, always when you read between the lines, it gives us insight to the possibility of the segregation being something much, much later. And then we have the actual sacrifices themselves. The first sacrifice that we have here is an olah. The verse says, first of all, it gives a stipulation that sacrifices are to be brought from mina behema. This is a general concept, from livestock, mina bakar or min hatzon, from the cattle and from tzon, which really covers goats and sheep. And it refers to as im olah korbano. This is verse 3. If, and they always this principle of the if, because there are different sacrifices, and inside sacrifice there are different possibilities. So if it's an olah, now olah is obviously the completely burnt offering. No one eats from it, and the dilemma is, what does the word olah actually mean? Does it mean from going up, that the entire sacrifice goes up? Because it really comes from root Allah with an ayin, which means to go up. Some people think it's from the word me'uleh, the best sacrifice, the highest, the elevated sacrifice. A lot of different opinions how this actually works. So we have either from the bakar or from the tzon, and it actually gives us a very clear description of these two sacrifices. And it really is very general, because no one, in the bakar, and the first sacrifice, it really describes into detail all the different parts. You cut it to the head, the peder, which is the area of the stomach. This is verse 8. And you place it on the fire, and you have to wash them. You don't put on the altar, you don't put dirty parts. You have to wash them off, because remember, this wasn't a very sanitized area. I mean, they didn't have clean areas and everything. So even during the process, dirt can get on, sand can get on, or whatever it might be, or dirt. So you have to make sure you wash it before you put it on the altar, because it's shameful. You don't offer before God something dirty. This is why the washing has to be done. And I find it interesting the word rachatz here, because the word rachatz appears over and over again. This is in verse 9. It says b'mayim. The word rachatz appears over and over again in the book of Leviticus, and it really means to wash. And the reason I'm pointing this out is because in rabbinic thinking, rachatz, for example, it says v'rachatzet b'saro v'mayim. They say, this is dipping in a mikveh. This is washing, cleansing oneself in the mikveh, which is a body of water, and you have to dip yourself in. But rachatz here clearly means that you pour water over the meat itself, over the parts of the animal. And this clearly indicates that rachatz means to take water through a vessel and pouring it on the body. And this is very important for the discussion of how does one cleanse oneself? Is a shower enough? Do you really have to go to a mikveh? And I'm saying this from the biblical perspective. From the practicality perspective of what Judaism does, it's really full immersion. But there's a difference in the usage of words, and we'll cover this on the program I do with my wife. I've been doing with my wife over the laws of Nida. We'll talk about the differences, what we find in the Bible, and what's done today. And we have the same description, a very similar description with livestock. But then what's very interesting is description that you actually can bring birds. Now, when you do birds, it says several interesting things here. Instead of using the word shahat, as we appears several times, you use the word malak. Now, melika seems to be more breaking the neck and exposing the veins. Do you actually break the neck, or do you do like a small incision? For example, in Talmudic sources, they talk about the Kohanim having sharp nails on their thumbs, so they can actually do an incision to just kill the animal without even having to use a knife. But what's very clear is that the word shahat does not show up here. It uses the word malak. And anyone who's ever slaughtered a bird, and I've been involved in animal slaughtering, so no, I'm not a vegetarian. Some people ask me what I think about vegetarianism. I actually wrote an article about that. So I've actually been involved in slaughtering animals and taking them apart, and I did this as an educational tool. We were actually studying Chulin, which is the Talmudic tractate that deals with slaughtering, and some people learned this in parallel with Zvachim, which is the temple service of the Talmud, some parts of the temple service of the Talmud, and we wanted to learn about the animals, so we actually brought in a goat and a sheep. We couldn't bring a cow. Cow was just too big, but a goat and a sheep was possible, and we also brought in pigeons at one point, and we saw how it's done. We took the animals apart to see the different parts of the animals. There's a lot of practicality here that I've actually seen and done with my own hands. When I say with my own hands, I mean literally with my own hands. I was part of the actions themselves. And what's interesting here is that the amount of blood that comes out of a bird is like very, very, very small. I mean, some birds sometimes go into stress, and then a lot of blood comes out. So here is why it says, "V'nimtza damo al kil mizbeach." You have to squeeze. Mitsui seems to be more of the idea. Is it the root matzah or motz? Some debates about this, but the idea is that you have to squeeze the blood out because it's this very, very small bird. And then you tear the animal into two halves. There's no really nituach as we have in the larger animals. It says v'shisa oto bichnafав. You have to tear the animal into two, but you don't necessarily separate the two pieces. Hopefully this is not too graphic for everyone. But if you want to know how the temple service works, you have that. Then you also have even a grain offering. And what's so interesting here is the associations. The Bible uses a lot of associative principles. So we have all the descriptions of what the olah is, and then we go to grain offerings. Now, most sacrifices were bought with a grain offering and a wine and a libation offering in general. And what's very interesting, what happens here in chapter 2, and this is a chapter that's going to be very important for us, it goes through different offerings that can exist. Like, for example, just dough or even forms of bread. And it talks about solet. Now, if you open up a modern day dictionary and you look up the word solet, solet is understood to be the what's left after you sift flour. I think it's called semolina or something like that in English. I was afraid to confuse it with salmonella, but it's semolina or something like that. And it's a yellow. Those who know, most Americans will know what this is. Israelis also know what solet is. When you go to the store, you buy a bag of solet. It comes out this yellowy substance that you can make. For example, cornbread. It looks like cornbread, but it's not corn. Cornbread is actually made out of actual corn, but it's the same color as corn flour, but it's not as it's a little finer. But the solet here in the Torah is actually white flour or quasi-white flour, because when it was white, it was considered to be more expensive. So solet here means that it's mesulat, that it's gone through a sieve or something like that, to be able to actually get refined flour. So first thing we have here is this oil, and you mix it together, and you basically take this as raw flour and just put it on the altar with everything and the frankincense that goes with it, the levona. Then you can also give baked goods. For example, you can make chalot matzot, be'olot b'shem, and chalot are thicker bread. The word challah probably comes from the root chalal, which means spaces, or chalal, which means a space. So basically, the same way dough is raised today, and you have all these little air bubbles that get created inside. The idea of chalot is really thicker bread. So this is chalot matzot. So obviously they haven't risen, because it's basically a type of matzah bread. What it's really describing is thicker loaves of bread. And then you can also bring it on, for example, a skillet, which is basically you break it up, patototopitim, you break it up into little pieces, and you technically fry them, and then you put them on the altar. And then you have malcheshet, which is more like a pot. This is verse 7. And you make listen as if they're making some kind of a gruel or something like that. Basically, another type of some kind of cooked offering. And what it really makes a point here is that you're not supposed to put any se'ol or davash on the altar. No leaven and no honey. Now the honey part, or even the leaven part, is not very clear. But because it states this, it's understood why the offerings themselves are done with oil. Because when you mix in oil prevents the entrance of oxygen, which means the chances of it starting to ferment, even if you say the fermentation process actually takes several weeks. I mean, we've made sourdough at home, and the fermentation process takes to create the sourdough or the sourdough head, which is the starter. It takes weeks. I mean, at least 2 weeks to produce a good quality one. But it's possible that the reason it says here oil and not water is to prevent any possibility of fermentation, even by mistake. That, for example, if you didn't clean the vessels properly, you have some left, that will not function as a starter because it's been mixed with oil. And as an association of grain offerings, we actually reach verses 14, 15, and 16. These are very, very important verses for our discussion about the Aviv and about grain offerings in general, but specifically for the Aviv. I'm actually going to first of all read this in Hebrew and break it down. It says, Ve'im takriv minchat bikurim la'Adonai. Aviv kalui ba'esh, geres karmel, takriv et minchat bikurecha. And then it goes into the description of how you do it. Really, verse 14 is the most important one for me. It says, V'natata aleha shemen, v'samta aleha levona minchahi. This is the place where it's exactly the same. You put in oil and frankincense. V'ktir HaKohen et azkarata, and the Kohen will sacrifice its pinching. Azkar here is like to remembrance, but it's really a pinch that he takes, a small quantity that he takes with his hand. It's not a pinch with your thumb and your finger, your index finger, but really with your hand. You take a quantity with your entire hand. Migarsahu mishamnaf, from its crushed grain and from its oil. Al kol levonotan, all the frankincense, ishel Adonai. But the focus here is verse 4. And this is the thing. The Aviv, or really not the Aviv, but the Omer, the waving sheaf, which appears in chapter 23, is referred to as Reshit Ketzilchem, the first of the harvest. This is referred to as Minchat Bikurim. English translations explain both sections as being first fruits. And I've had this been asked, directed to me as a question so many times. First fruit, everyone's using the word first fruit, first fruit, first fruit. And the problem is that the King James Version of the Bible, which a lot of people trust as their source, and what's known as the Strong's Concordance, which is, by the way, not a dictionary. You can actually not use Strong's Concordance to really interpret words. If you want to do that, get a dictionary. But they all translate these as first fruits. Now, the word bikurim is first fruits. Okay? But for the omer, for the sheaf that's woven, if that's woven, the sheaf of waving, we'll call it, it is reshit ketzir, it's called reshit ketzirchem. And reshit and bikurim are not the same thing. So what is chapter 2, verse 14 describing? It's describing the ceremony or the celebration of first fruits brought by the individual. Look at the context here. We have different grain offerings which individuals will bring to the temple together with their sacrifice, or as a separate offering if they don't have the ability to bring a full animal, if they're very poor. But these are still in the realm of the individual sacrifices of the individual person, not a temple ceremony like the Omer. Okay? And what it describes here is when people bring their first fruits, their bikurim. When do you bring bikurim? From around the time of Shavuot, when things ripen, when you've harvested, when you have the ability to bring your offerings. The word seorah is not mentioned here at all. Okay? And it says that when you bring your first fruits, your actual bikurim, then you bring aviv kalui ba'esh geres karmel. It gives you two possibilities here. Aviv, which is a soft dough stage, which means you squeeze the grain, but it doesn't pop out, and it's basically, or actually, it's firm. It's really not soft dough. It's firm dough. Sorry, my mistake. It's firm dough, but it's not very firm. It's still a little squishy in your hands. That's aviv. Carmel, on the other hand, is understood as being much more advanced grain, which means you can bring it to a point of geres, the word garus, which means crushed. So the description here gives us two options of the state of the grain: one aviv, one carmel. This is very, very important, because if I need to bring the wave offering, if we say that if we take the interpretation that some people want to take here, that this is the wave offering, why do I have two options here? The point is that people's fields mature differently, and therefore people might bring a state of aviv or a state of carmel. But the main principle here is that this is a bikurim offering, another reshit ketzirchem, as it's mentioned in chapter 23. And if we go to chapter 23, and I prefer to keep this in isolation in the book of Leviticus without going to Deuteronomy. And it says, Kitavo la'aretz, chapter 23, verse 10, says, Kitavo la'aretz, when you enter the land, asher ani noten lachem, which I give to you, v'uktzartem et ketzirah, and you harvest its harvest. Vevetem et omer reshit ketzirchem elako, and you bring the omer of reshit ketzirchem. Now, reshit can mean the best of, or the first of, but it doesn't use the word bikurim. Okay, and it tells you which animals you bring with it. So it's very clear this is reshit katzir. This is the first of the harvest, or the best of the harvest, and therefore there's a difference between this and the principle of bikurim, which here is clearly a personal, private sacrifice each individual brings for himself when they want to bring a bikurim offering. But the description of when do you start counting the omer count, or the 7 weeks, the Shavuot, that comes as a ceremonial offering done possibly with only one sheaf, because his omer reshit ketzirchem, okay? Maybe from the first field that reaches the point where you can actually harvest. It's possible that several people will show up with their omer, or maybe the Kohanim had to make a decision where they bring it from. But here it's very, very clear. This is more of a ceremonial omer that's bought from one sheaf, and it's one manipulation is done with it, where they make a sacrifice with it and everything. It's not something as if everyone suddenly shows up with their omer. Here's mine. They do it one after the other. This is connected to a larger ceremony of a national offering. And you do this national offering only once. You bring a certain amount of sacrifice that come with this one individual omer. Here, this is a bikurim, which means first fruit, which means everyone brings with them whatever sacrifices, whatever they have in their field. Okay? It raises the question, does aviv specifically only mean to the barley, or is it a state of grain for all grains? I think it's a state of grain for all grains, but the first grain to reach the point of aviv around this time of year is the seorah, is the barley, and therefore this is why chodesh aviv is the chodesh of the barley, because that's also the same time of chodesh harishon and so on. So it's very clear that you can't combine chapter 2 with chapter 23 and say, oh, it's the same thing. What does this mean? You need to find aviv before the waving, not at the waving. The waving of the omer is not done with aviv. It's done with harvest-ready grains, which means when you go out and you look for aviv towards the end of the 12th month, it has to be aviv just before the month begins, or at the month, as the month begins, that in 2-3 weeks in the future, then you will find harvest-ready grain. Not the other way around. It's not like, there's a potential here that it's going to become aviv in 2 weeks. Potential, first of all, is a very dangerous thing, because, for example, it's raining at the moment. Here in Israel, I'm doing this when there's a semi-storm outside, raining. It's been raining since last night, and it's going to apparently continue raining throughout the entire week until the end of the week. If I'm supposed to find aviv in about a week and a half, basically I'm supposed to find aviv by next week, by the end of the week, okay? This causes the chances of finding aviv to drop to the ground, and it reduces it. But as I said, it doesn't need to be aviv then, it has to be harvest ready. I need to have the possibility of having harvest-ready barley somewhere in the beginning of Chag HaMatzot. So how can I make a decision based on the maybe, ifs and buts? It doesn't work like that. And that's the problem with some of the interpretations about the Aviv. So this is more to do with those who do follow the Aviv, but that's why we had to say there's no Aviv this year, there's no Aviv this month, and we have to wait another month. Because I need to see Aviv by the beginning of the first month. Not that it shows up in the middle of the month. And the idea is that you find Aviv in the beginning, or just before the month begins, and then you can declare the entire month as being the month of Aviv, because it gives the keynote. It kind of denotes the entire demeanor of the entire month. This is the month where we discovered Aviv from the get-go. The idea of Chodesh Aviv, it doesn't mean that it's going to be Aviv the entire month, but you find Aviv in the beginning, they say, this is a month we found Aviv. So there's a few weird things that go on about this, which I really don't understand the logic of them. I don't understand how people can say certain things. I'm going to declare this a month of Aviv, but I'm going to declare it based on a potential. I'd rather declare Aviv when I actually see Aviv. This retrospect idea is very difficult. Then we have, later on, we have the sacrifice known as shlamim, which comes from the word shalom. A lot of people refer to this as the peace offering. This is a sacrifice where the owner is also involved. Now, a lot of scholars understand that the Aviv, I'm still stuck with the Aviv. The Aviv has been haunting me for over a week. The shlamim was, some people see this as the original sacrifice. A lot of people say, the olah is the original sacrifice because it goes completely to God. But scholars actually identify the shlamim as being the first offering in the ancient world. Though, for example, when we look at Cain and Hevel, or Cain and Abel, that they brought their sacrifice, and see the sacrifice were completely offered to God. From what we know from other cultures around us, that shlamim, or basically eating your sacrifice together with your God, was like a communing together with your God, drawing closer to your God. So the shlamim come from basically male or female. This is the important thing. Basically enables you to bring out of any animal. And what it also specifies, this is the most important thing for me here, it specifies that there are parts of the animal that have to be sacrificed. And it goes over and it says, it describes, this is verse 3, chapter 3, the colon fat. So a lot of people say chalev is fat, but this is not true. It's not just fat, it's other parts as well. So first of all, people who, for example, eat their steak and won't eat the fat because they think that you're forbidden to eat that is incorrect. The chalev, it doesn't say any fat. It describes these things very specifically. So there's colon fat. It looks like a webby type of fat. It looks like a sheet of web. And it covers the kerev, which is the stomach. And all the fat which is on the stomach itself. And the two kidneys and the fat which is upon them. Okay? Asher la kesalim, which is on the sides of the stomach, bowel, or the stomach hollowed out area. There's a word in English, I can't remember what it is now. And then it says, Vetayoteret ala kaved ala kelayot siren, and the extra of the liver, which seems to be like a little finger that hangs off of the side of the liver, you will remove it as well. And then Vayiqra, you will place it on the fire, which means it turns into kitol, which means smoke. You basically smoke them or burn them on the altar. And sheep have an extra fat, which is chelboha aliyah temima, the fat of the tail. Now, I know that American and European sheep don't have this, but the Mediterranean sheep have a lot of fat on their tail. I mean, like really traditional sheep have this massive, massive piece of fat. Now, it doesn't mean tail is forbidden. Remember when I first did my show about fat and blood, I indicated that it's on the tail, and then people started asking me questions. Well, does it mean I'm not supposed to eat tail? For example, in South Africa, they have this dish which is made of oxtail, and I also know that in Yemen they have dishes like this. And people ask me, is it now forbidden to eat tail? And my answer was no, it's not any tail. It's just the tail of sheep, and it's a specific variety of sheep that actually have a lot of fat there. But the point is that fat is not forbidden. Tail fat is. And just so you should know, when people eat shawarma or jarro meat, in many cases they add fat on the top. That's usually tail fat, which means it's a problem to. If you go strictly according to Leviticus, then it's forbidden. Obviously, there's also a prohibition of blood, which shows up in chapter 7. We'll elaborate about this even more. But we have a clear description here of what is the chelev that's forbidden, and there's a difference between chelev and shuman. Though shuman seems to be a latter word, but chelev is a word that's used to describe things which are prime, because anyone who understands how you manipulate fat when you cook, and I myself being a trained chef know this, some of the most fanciest dishes out there would use colon fat. For example, I have recipes that I've seen, and I have them at home, of you take colon fat and you wrap lamb chops to add more fat to them to make them more juicy. You can make different type of cutlets, or you can make different little burger-like things, which you add the colon fat, you wrap them in. Colon fat becomes juicy, and these dishes go for a lot of money. And there's a reason. Colon fat, there's only one small quantity in every animal, and if you want to use that, you're going to have to charge a higher price. It's like tongue. There's only one tongue in a cow. There's only one tongue in some of these in all these animals, so it's a lot more expensive than other parts. But the word chelev, because we have, for example, chelev chitas bi'im, the fat of the wheat, I will satisfy them. The word chelev can be used in different places also to indicate prime or best or most nurturing part. So remember, it is not any fat. It's specific types of fat which are described here in chapter 3. Now the problem we have here is that we're almost out of time. But I'll just quickly go over here. We have several sacrifices which are atonement sacrifices for the people, for a prince, for the individual. And I think one of the most important things that we have here is what we have in chapter 5, which is at the end of the parasha. It says that there's this really weird, there's very difficult description. I wouldn't say weird, but difficult description here. It says, V'im nefesh ki techeta, and if there's a person who has sinned, v'asta achat mikol mitzvot Adonai asher lo ta'asena, and they will do for one of the commandments of the Lord which are not to be done. V'lo yada ve'ashem ve'nasa avon, and he did not know, and he is found guilty, and he will burden his sin. This goes into the whole debate of what does it mean to be aware of sin? What does it mean that someone sins and this is the type of sin that you bring sacrifice? Because as we know, it says later on in Numbers that a person who does with a raised hand, basically a rebellious hand, or does as rebellion, they don't have the ability to atone. So it's clear that if you do as rebellion, then you can't atone. Then obviously not knowing, as we have here, is obviously unintentional. But the question is raised about a person that knows a sin exists, but still commits it. Can they also bring a sacrifice? And the answer is yes. And the reason I say yes is because the description of a person who is forbidden to bring a sacrifice is one it does by rebellion, not because of a weak heart. A person who does something because of a weak heart is a person that has a weak character, but it doesn't mean that they rebelled. And therefore, even for intentional sin, there actually is a sacrifice. Now, a lot of people teach this whole idea. Intentional sin, there is no atoning. No, there's a difference. There's intentional sin, and then there's rebellious sin. And that's the difference. Not knowing about a prohibition is one thing. You don't know. The biblical law says if you don't know, you're not found as guilty, but you still need to atone for your sin because the sin creates a barrier between you and God. But people who have weak characters, or for some reason decide to commit a sin, but there's no intention of rebellion, can still bring a sacrifice. Because we find this difference here. We find lo yada versus shagag. If you go up a little bit more, and you go to verse 14 in chapter 5, it says, Nefesh kitim ol ma'al, a person who is ma'al is a type of stealing or a deed that's forbidden. V'hata'a bishgaga, and he sinned unintentionally. Okay, mikotche Adonai, from the holy, the sanctified things of God. Basically, things which are dedicated to the temple, or things, or whatever that might be, something which has been dedicated to God. An animal that's supposed to be a sacrifice and someone stole it. It's interesting that there's a difference between shgaga and lo yada. Shgaga means a mistake. Lo yada means not knowing at all. But shgaga can probably fall in the category of a sin that's done by mistake, but not as a mistake of, oh, I didn't know, but more in the sense of, I became weak and did so. And I think this is the reason why these two elements are side by side, shagag versus lo yada. And this is why I say very clearly that even if a person knew something is forbidden and they still did it, there's still an opening as long as it's not rebellious. Because that's the principle of Yad Ramah. In any case, there are a lot more things we can say here. There are other sacrifices. There are interesting things here which appear in chapter 5, for example, or sacrifice that's over not obeying a certain, or not obeying a declaration, or avoiding bringing testimony. Let's take a second to describe this. So we actually have, I know I skipped ahead now, but it's a very interesting subject as well. So we have these different sacrifices which are done through not direct action of doing a sin, but avoiding doing certain things. Like, for example, a person hears a call out for testimony, and there's an oath. If someone doesn't bring forth a testimony, there can be a curse upon them, or if they discover that these people had knowledge, that they can be punished, there'll be a penalty in some way or another. And they are a witness, so they saw, they knew, and they didn't know, and they have to burden their sin. Why punish people for such a thing? Because there's a collective responsibility. If you know someone's committed a crime, it's harming everyone. It causes damage. It's like a snowball that you start rolling, and it can cause damage to everyone. So they became unclean, and they harmed the temple. So again, we have here that they have here side by side, knowing and not knowing. They became unclean, and then they forgot, and they entered the temple. So it equates knowing and knowing is on the same level. You can know something is wrong, or you can know or you not know that something is wrong, okay, and still have to be punished for them, but they're sitting side by side. This actually strengthens what I said earlier about the shagag versus the lo yada. And then we also have a person who takes an oath to do or not do, and he forgets, and he knew. So there's knowing at some stage, and then forgetting, which is really similar to not knowing, and so on. And we have all these classifications. It's very interesting how you notice that each chapter opens up with a certain principle, and then it works off of that principle. What is knowledge? How do you know? So knowing can be knowing beforehand and deliberately not doing, or knowing and forgetting. So, for example, you know that something is forbidden, but at that given moment, you were in lust for something, and your mind as if forgot. Because knowing means that you respond to it. If you're not responsive to your knowledge, it means as if you forget. That's, I think, one of the principles that works here as well. What does it mean to know and not know? In any case, I hope you enjoyed this recording. And I don't promise it's always going to be this format of highly detailed and everything, but I think that putting down the principles of how sacrifices work and how does a temple work and what are some of the words that we find here is very, very important for the understanding of the book of Leviticus in general. You have to remember there are different spheres here. There's a sphere of holiness, and there's a sphere here of the temple. There's holiness which is in our homes, and there's holiness that has to do with the temple. There's a sphere of cleansiness here as well, which will develop throughout the discussions about the book of Vayiqra. And hopefully people will ask questions. And again, I encourage you, ask questions. I know people always, we liked it, then just do a thumbs up or something and then carry on. There are almost no comments. Please do comment if you have anything to say. And again, don't forget to visit HebrewInIsrael.net. That's my website. Don't rely on Facebook. Facebook limits what you can see and know. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Also share. Sharing is caring. It means more people can see. For the Aviv Search, for example, thousands of people shared. I looked at my statistics, and what I discovered was that though I have several thousand people, the information from the Aviv Search reached over 20,000 people. There were thousands of people engaged in what's actually going on, but something like 3,000 people were engaged. It reached close to 30,000 people. Actually, when I look at the numbers, like 28,000 people were exposed to the details about the Aviv Search. And this is how important is what we can call crowdsourcing, or whatever you call it. If you share, it reaches a lot more people. If you think that this information is valid and you want others to know, and you want people to know what we consider to be the truth, then if you share, more people will know about it. So in any case, thank you for joining me again. If you have any questions, HebrewInIsrael@gmail.com, or you can comment on Facebook or on the website. If you listen to this during Shabbat, Shabbat Shalom. If before Shabbat, hopefully your preparations towards Shabbat will go well. Kol Tov.